The ice exploded beneath James Mitchell's knees. Sharp cracks raced outward like spider webs. His breath came in white puffs. The girl was sinking. Her fingers, pale as bone, clawed at the jagged edge. 20 feet of black water separated them. The expensive coat billowed around her small frame like a dark parachute dragging her down. But her eyes... Christ, her eyes weren't filled with panic. They held relief. "Don't move," James bellowed, sliding the wooden plank across the treacherous surface. The girl stared at him with those haunting blue eyes. Not the look of someone fighting to live. The look of someone who'd finally found what she was searching for. In the bottom of a frozen Minnesota lake, James reached out his calloused hand, and in that heartbeat between life and death, he had no idea he was about to pull something far more dangerous than a drowning child from Cedar Falls Lake. He was about to rescue the one person who would destroy everything he thought he knew about being poor. The morning had started like every other morning for James Mitchell. Cold, quiet, and broke. His alarm hadn't worked in 3 months, but his body clock never failed him. 6 a.m. sharp, every single day, whether he wanted it or not. The small woodworking shop attached to his house felt more like a tomb than a workplace these days. 2 orders this week. 2. He'd made more money selling lemonade as a kid. The heating bill sat unopened on his workbench, right next to the overdue rent notice and a photo of Sarah holding newborn Connor 14 years ago, back when life still made sense. Connor had been gone when James woke up. Again. The kid's bed was still made from yesterday, which meant he'd either snuck out after midnight or never came home at all. At 14, Connor was already taller than James and twice as angry at the world. Ever since Sarah died 3 years ago, the boy had been slipping away like sand through James's fingers. Last week, the school called about fighting. The week before, it was skipping classes. James didn't know how to reach his own son anymore, let alone fix whatever was breaking inside him. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with something that almost sounded like companionship. James poured the bitter liquid into Sarah's favorite mug, a chipped ceramic thing with "World's Best Mom" painted in fading pink letters. He'd tried using other mugs, couldn't do it. Some habits were harder to break than others, and grief had a way of making even the strongest men cling to the smallest comforts. Through the frost-covered window, he could see Cedar Falls Lake stretching out like a sheet of white marble, perfect and untouched. That's when he spotted the black sedan parked near the lake's edge. Expensive. Out of place in a neighborhood where most people drove trucks older than their mortgages. The car had been there since yesterday afternoon, and something about it nagged at James like a splinter under the skin. Rich folks didn't just park by Cedar Falls Lake. They drove through Cedar Falls, windows up, doors locked, heading somewhere better. The license plates were too far away to read, but even from his kitchen window, James could see the car was worth more than he'd make in 5 years. He was still staring at the sedan when the scream cut through the morning air like a knife through silk. High-pitched, desperate, and close. Too close. James dropped the mug, and Sarah's favorite ceramic exploded against the kitchen floor in a dozen pieces. He was out the door before his brain caught up to his feet, running toward the lake in nothing but jeans and a flannel shirt. The cold hit him like a slap, but he kept running. Someone was in trouble, and in a town where everyone knew everyone, you didn't hesitate. You helped first and asked questions later. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. Blonde hair plastered to her head, soaked through to the bone, and sinking fast into the black water where the ice had given way beneath her feet. She must have walked too close to the edge, where the current kept the ice thin and treacherous. James had warned Connor about that exact spot 100 times. The water was deeper there than it looked, and the cold could kill you in minutes. But this wasn't Connor. This was a stranger, a child who shouldn't have been anywhere near Cedar Falls Lake without supervision. Stay calm, James shouted, grabbing the longest piece of lumber from his shop's outdoor pile. A 2x10, 12 feet long, should do the trick if he could get close enough. The ice groaned under his weight as he crawled forward on his belly, distributing his mass as evenly as possible. Every crack sounded like a gunshot in the still morning air. The girl had stopped struggling, which was either very good or very bad. Sometimes people got calm right before they went under for the last time. James pushed the thought away and focused on the distance between them. 15 feet, 10 feet, almost there. The rescue took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. The girl was conscious but hypothermic, her lips blue and her body shaking violently. James wrapped her in his flannel shirt and carried her to his shop, cranking up the space heater and grabbing every blanket he could find. She was wearing clothes that probably cost more than James made in a month: designer jeans, Italian leather boots, and a coat with tags he didn't recognize but knew were expensive. Everything about her screamed money, from her perfect teeth to her manicured fingernails. But she was also just a scared kid, alone and half frozen in his workshop. "What's your name, sweetheart?" James asked, rubbing warmth back into her hands. The girl looked at him with those startling blue eyes, confused and lost. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, frowning like she was trying to solve a difficult puzzle. I don't know," she whispered finally. "I can't remember." James felt his stomach drop. Head injury, maybe, or shock. Either way, this was bigger than he could handle alone. He reached for his phone to call 911, but the girl grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Please," she said, and there was something in her voice that stopped James cold. "Don't call anyone yet. Please, I'm scared." And that's how James Mitchell, struggling single father and failing carpenter, found himself harboring a mystery girl in his workshop while the expensive sedan sat empty by the lake. He had no idea that in saving her life, he was about to change his own forever. 2 hours later, Connor walked through the front door and stopped dead in his tracks. James was in the kitchen, cooking scrambled eggs for 3 instead of 2, while a girl he'd never seen before sat at their table, wearing his old clothes and sipping hot chocolate from his mother's second-favorite mug. Connor's first instinct was anger. Who was this stranger in their house, using Mom's things? But something about the girl's quiet presence made him pause. She looked lost, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "This is Anna," James said, not looking up from the stove. It wasn't her real name, but she'd chosen it when she couldn't remember her own, and it seemed to fit. "She had an accident at the lake. She'll be staying with us until we can find her family." Connor dropped his backpack and studied the girl with the critical eye of a teenager who'd learned not to trust easily. She was younger than him, maybe 11, with blonde hair that was still damp and clothes that hung loose on her small frame. But there was something about her that seemed older, like she'd seen things that didn't match her age. "Where are you from?" Connor asked, sliding into the chair across from Anna. She looked at him for a long moment before shaking her head. "I don't remember," she said simply, and Connor caught something in her voice that made him believe her. It wasn't that she was lying. She genuinely didn't know. "What do you remember?" he pressed, ignoring the warning look from his father. Anna frowned, concentrating hard. Cold water, a car that smelled like leather, and... She paused, touching a small bandage on her forehead. "Someone crying, but I can't see their face." The police came that afternoon, just as James knew they would. Officer Martinez was a good man who'd known Sarah and had been patient with Connor's recent troubles. He took Anna's description and promised to check missing person reports. But Cedar Falls was a small town with small town resources. Without a last name or a clear description of where she'd come from, finding Anna's family would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. We can take her to the county children's services." Martinez offered, but something in Anna's eyes made James shake his head. "She can stay here," James heard himself saying, "until you find her people." It was a decision that would complicate everything, but looking at Anna sitting at their kitchen table, wearing Connor's old clothes and trying to smile despite the fear in her eyes, James couldn't imagine doing anything else. She needed help, and he had help to give. It was that simple, even if nothing else about the situation was simple at all. Connor surprised him by nodding agreement, and for the first time in months, James felt like maybe they were a team again. The first week with Anna was an adjustment for everyone. She was polite to the point of being formal, saying please and thank you for everything, and insisting on making her bed with military precision every morning. She ate whatever was put in front of her without complaint, even James's consistently overcooked meals, and she never asked for anything beyond the basic necessities. But there were things about her that didn't quite fit. She knew how to use chopsticks perfectly, but had to be shown how to work a can opener. She could identify expensive wine by smell, but didn't know how to tie her shoes properly. Connor, who'd been suspicious at first, gradually warmed to Anna's presence. She was genuinely interested in his schoolwork and never talked down to him like other adults did. More importantly, she made their father smile again. Really smile, not the forced expression James had worn for the past 3 years. When Anna helped James sand a piece of oak for a custom bookshelf, her technique was surprisingly good for someone who claimed no memory of woodworking. "You've done this before," James observed, but Anna just shrugged, genuinely puzzled by her own abilities. The nightmares started during the second week. Anna would wake up screaming about dark water and broken glass, about someone calling her name in a voice she couldn't quite place. James would sit with her until she fell back asleep, and gradually Anna began to share fragments of dreams that felt more like memories. A big house with too many rooms, a man in an expensive suit who never smiled, the sound of shouting from behind closed doors. But whenever James tried to get more details, Anna would shake her head, frustrated by the gaps in her own mind. Dr. Sarah Chen, the town's only psychiatrist, explained that trauma could cause selective amnesia, especially in children. Her memories might come back gradually, or they might be gone forever. She told James during Anna's evaluation. The important thing is to provide stability while her brain heals. What Dr. Chen didn't say, but James understood anyway, was that some memories were lost on purpose. Sometimes forgetting was the mind's way of protecting itself from things too painful to remember. Connor found himself oddly protective of Anna, walking her to the library after school and making sure she wasn't alone when the nightmares hit. She was smart, scary smart, and could help him with math homework that normally left him frustrated and angry. But she also needed help with simple things, like how to order food at the diner or why people laughed at jokes she didn't understand. It was like she'd lived her entire life in a different world with different rules, and now she was trying to learn how normal people lived. The mystery deepened when Anna accidentally fixed Connor's laptop, which had been running slow for months. She claimed she didn't know anything about computers, but her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, clearing caches and updating drivers with the skill of someone who'd done it 100 times before. "Where did you learn that?" Connor asked, but Anna looked as surprised as he was. "I don't know," she said, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. "I just knew what to do." By the third week, Anna had become part of their routine. She woke up early to help James in the shop, proving to have an intuitive understanding of wood grain and joinery that impressed even him. She cooked simple meals that were better than anything James had managed since Sarah died, using techniques she claimed not to remember learning. And she listened, really listened, when Connor talked about school or his friends or how much he missed his mother. For the first time since Sarah's death, their house felt like a home again, instead of just a place where they happened to sleep. But there were moments when Anna would freeze, staring at nothing with an expression of pure terror, like she was seeing ghosts that no one else could see. She'd flinch when the phone rang or when cars drove by too slowly. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she'd touch that small scar on her forehead with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had too many missing pieces. James began to wonder if Anna's family was still looking for her, and if so, why they hadn't found her yet. The turning point came during the 4th week, when Anna woke up screaming a name that wasn't Anna. "Victoria!" she shouted, sitting bolt upright in bed with tears streaming down her face. "My name is Victoria!" James rushed to her room, finding her shaking and confused, touching her head like she could feel new memories trying to break through. "I remember," she whispered, but when James asked what she remembered, Anna, Victoria, just shook her head. "I don't want to remember," she said. "Can't I just stay here? Can't I just be Anna?" That night, after Victoria had fallen back asleep, James sat at his computer and typed "Victoria missing Minnesota" into the search engine. What he found made his blood run cold. Victoria Sterling, 11 years old, daughter of business magnate Richard Sterling, had been missing for over a month. The reward for her safe return was $50,000, more money than James would make in 2 years. The photo showed a girl in expensive clothes standing next to a man in a tailored suit, both of them looking formal and distant. But the eyes were unmistakable. Those were Anna's eyes, Victoria's eyes, staring back at him from the screen. James closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the girl sleeping in his spare room and the life she'd been running from. Victoria Sterling was worth more money than he could imagine, but Anna was worth something that couldn't be measured in dollars. She was the daughter who'd taught Connor to laugh again, the helper who'd made his workshop feel alive, the missing piece that had somehow made their broken family whole. And tomorrow, he'd have to decide whether to make the phone call that would take her away from them forever. The next morning brought fresh snow, and a decision James had been dreading. Victoria, he couldn't think of her as Anna anymore, was in the kitchen making pancakes with a recipe she claimed not to remember learning, humming a song that sounded expensive and classical. Connor was helping her, the two of them working together like siblings who'd known each other for years instead of weeks. They looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way that James hadn't seen in his house since before Sarah got sick. "Victoria," James said quietly, and the girl's hand stilled on the pancake batter. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed like she was bracing for impact. "We need to talk." Connor looked between them, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, and Victoria finally turned around with an expression that was far too old for her 11-year-old face. "You found out who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "You're going to send me back." James pulled out his phone and showed her the missing person report. Victoria stared at the photo of herself and her father for a long time before speaking. "He doesn't care about me," she said simply. "He cares about his reputation. I'm just another possession that got lost." Connor looked at the reward amount and whistled softly. $50,000, he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, just understanding. They all knew what that money could mean for their family: rent payments, heat bills, maybe even college for Connor someday. "Is that why you were at the lake?" James asked gently. "Were you trying to—" But Victoria cut him off with a shake of her head. "I wasn't trying to hurt myself," she said. "I was trying to disappear. I thought if I could get far enough away, maybe I could become someone else, someone normal." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I didn't count on the ice being so thin. I didn't count on someone like you pulling me out." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, followed immediately by the sound of expensive cars pulling into their driveway. James looked out the window and felt his heart sink. 3 black SUVs, the kind that screamed money and power, were parked outside his modest house. Men in dark suits were getting out, along with a man who looked exactly like the photo on the missing person report. Richard Sterling had found his daughter, and from the look on his face, he wasn't in a mood for pleasantries. "Victoria Rose Sterling," Richard Sterling said as he walked into James's kitchen without invitation, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never being told no. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through?" Victoria, James couldn't think of her as Anna anymore, stood perfectly straight, her hands clasped behind her back like a soldier at attention. All the warmth and life drained from her face, replaced by a careful blankness that broke James's heart to see. "Hello, Father," Victoria said formally, and James realized this was who she'd been before, a perfectly mannered little girl playing a role in someone else's production. "I apologize for any inconvenience I may have caused." Richard Sterling barely glanced at James and Connor, dismissing them as irrelevant to the scene he was orchestrating. "Get your things," he told Victoria. "We're leaving immediately. I have meetings all afternoon, and this little adventure of yours has already cost me enough time." Connor stepped forward, his teenage awkwardness replaced by surprising protectiveness. "She doesn't want to go," he said, and Richard Sterling finally acknowledged his existence with a look of cold disdain. "What this child wants is irrelevant," Sterling said. "She's 11 years old and she belongs with her family." James felt anger rising in his chest, the kind of righteous fury that came from watching someone mistreat a child. "Family," he repeated. "When was the last time you asked her what she wanted?" Richard Sterling's laugh was sharp and humorless. "I don't have conversations with children, Mr. Mitchell," James said. "James Mitchell, and I don't have conversations with men who treat their daughters like property." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees as the 2 men faced each other across James's modest kitchen. Victoria stood between them, looking small and fragile despite the steel in her spine. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Sterling said. "Victoria has everything a child could want. The best schools, the finest clothes, every opportunity money can buy." "Except a parent who loves her," Connor said, and Sterling's face went white with rage. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Connor shot back. "Care about her. Treat her like she matters. Make her laugh. When's the last time you made her laugh?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Richard Sterling opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. And in that moment of silence, James saw something crack in the man's carefully constructed facade. "I provide for her," Sterling said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I give her everything she needs." "Except yourself," James said quietly. "You give her everything except yourself." Victoria had been silent during the exchange, but now she spoke up with a voice that was barely above a whisper. "He found my letter," she said, and both James and Connor turned to look at her. "The night I left, I wrote him a letter. I told him I was sorry for not being good enough, and that maybe he'd be happier without me around to disappoint him all the time." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. "I guess he found it after I didn't come home." Richard Sterling's composure cracked completely. "Victoria," he said, and for the first time, his voice held actual emotion. "You don't disappoint me. You're the only good thing in my life, and I've been so afraid of losing you the way I lost your mother that I forgot how to show you I care." He knelt down to Victoria's level, and James saw that the man was crying. "I'm sorry," Sterling said. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how to be a father without being afraid." The room fell silent except for the sound of 3 people crying, a billionaire, his daughter, and the man who'd saved them both from drowning in their own isolation. Connor stood beside James, his hand on his father's shoulder, watching a family begin to heal from wounds that money couldn't fix. It wasn't the reunion any of them had expected, but sometimes the most important conversations happened in the most unlikely places. After an hour of tears and difficult conversations, Richard Sterling made an offer that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of taking Victoria home immediately, he asked if she could stay with the Mitchells for a few more weeks while he learned how to be the father she deserved. "I need to change some things about my life," he said, "and Victoria needs stability while I figure out how to give her the childhood I took away." He also insisted on paying James for Victoria's care, not as a reward, but as a father supporting the people who'd cared for his daughter when he couldn't. The arrangement worked better than anyone expected. Richard Sterling visited every weekend, gradually learning how to talk to Victoria about things that didn't involve schedules or expectations. He learned to ask about her dreams, her fears, her favorite foods. He met Connor's teachers and James's neighbors, getting his first real look at how normal families lived and loved. And slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild a relationship with his daughter based on understanding rather than obligation. Victoria bloomed under the attention of two fathers, one who'd given her life and another who'd saved it. She kept the name Anna as a middle name, honoring the girl she'd become during her weeks with the Mitchells. Connor officially became her big brother when Richard Sterling surprised everyone by asking James if he'd be willing to share custody of Victoria, making their arrangement permanent. "She needs what you can give her," Sterling told James, "and frankly, so do I." 6 months after pulling a drowning girl from Cedar Falls Lake, James Mitchell stood in his expanded workshop, teaching Victoria and Connor how to build a bookshelf that would hold both Shakespeare and Dr. Seuss, leather-bound classics and comic books, bridging the gap between two very different worlds. Richard Sterling had invested in Mitchell Woodworks, turning James's struggling shop into a thriving business that employed 6 local craftsmen. But more importantly, he'd learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold. Connor was 15 now and getting ready for high school, his anger replaced by purpose and pride in his work. He talked about studying business so he could help run the workshop someday, maybe expand it into something bigger. Victoria was 12 and thriving, splitting her time between her father's world of board meetings and charity galas and James's world of sawdust and simple pleasures. She was learning that she could be both, Victoria Sterling and Anna Mitchell, without losing either part of herself. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation. James still drank his coffee from Sarah's mug every morning, but now he shared the kitchen with 2 kids who fought over the last pancake and debated homework with the intensity of corporate lawyers. Richard Sterling joined them for Sunday dinners, gradually learning to relax his formal facade and enjoy the chaos of family life. Sometimes James caught him looking around their modest dining room with wonder, as if he couldn't believe something so simple could make him so happy. On warm evenings, they all walked down to Cedar Falls Lake, where the ice had long since melted, and families brought their children to skip stones and watch the sunset. Victoria never showed fear of the water that had almost claimed her life. Instead, she seemed drawn to it, like she understood that sometimes the most dangerous places also held the most beautiful possibilities. "I used to think drowning was the worst thing that could happen to someone," she told James one evening, as they watched Connor teach Richard Sterling how to cast a fishing line. "Now I think maybe it's staying on the surface, never going deep enough to find what's really important." The expensive sedan was long gone from beside the lake, replaced by Richard Sterling's visits in a more modest car he'd bought specifically for trips to Cedar Falls. He'd learned to dress down for their weekend visits, trading his $1,000 suits for jeans and flannel shirts that made him look more like a father and less like a corporate photograph. Victoria had taught him that love wasn't a board meeting that could be scheduled or a problem that could be solved with money. It was something that grew in the small moments, in shared meals and bedtime stories, and the simple act of being present for someone who needed you. James often thought about that morning when he'd pulled Victoria from the lake, how he'd believed he was saving a drowning child. He understood now that he'd been drowning too, slowly and silently, in grief and failure and the terrible loneliness of trying to raise a child alone. Victoria hadn't just been rescued that day. She'd done some rescuing of her own, pulling James and Connor out of their isolation and back into the world of the living. Richard Sterling had been drowning too, suffocating in success that meant nothing without someone to share it with. The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows as James watched Victoria and Connor argue good-naturedly about the proper way to measure twice and cut once. Richard Sterling sat nearby, his expensive watch forgotten, as he lost himself in the simple pleasure of sanding a piece of cherry wood until it was smooth as silk. This was what wealth really looked like. James realized. Not the numbers in a bank account or the size of a house, but the richness that came from being surrounded by people who knew your worst qualities and chose to love you anyway. Victoria looked up from her measuring tape and caught James watching them all with the expression of a man who'd won the lottery without buying a ticket. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" she asked. She called both men Dad now, without confusion or favoritism, and James smiled at the question that had become ritual in their house. They all asked it of each other now, this family that had formed itself from the wreckage of loss and loneliness. "I was thinking," James said, "about how sometimes the most important things in life come to us when we're not looking for them. How sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning." Victoria nodded solemnly, understanding more about beginnings and endings than most adults ever would. "Like how I had to lose everything to find out what I really needed," she said, and Connor reached over to ruffle her hair with the casual affection of a brother who'd learned that family wasn't just about blood, but about choice. The bookshelf they were building would hold Victoria's books from both her worlds, leather-bound first editions from her father's library and dog-eared paperbacks from the Cedar Falls Public Library. Connor's science textbooks would sit next to James's woodworking manuals, and Richard Sterling's business biographies would share space with Sarah's collection of poetry that James had finally been able to read again. It was a perfect metaphor for the family they'd become, different pieces fitted together to create something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have been alone. As the afternoon wore on and the bookshelf took shape under their combined efforts, James thought about the girl he'd pulled from Cedar Falls Lake and the man she'd pulled from his own dark water. Victoria had taught them all that rescue wasn't a one-time event, but an ongoing choice to keep reaching out, keep pulling each other back to safety, keep believing that every ending contained the seeds of a new beginning. Sometimes the most valuable things came disguised as disasters, and sometimes you had to almost lose everything to understand what you'd been looking for all along. The bookshelf was nearly finished when Victoria stepped back to admire their work, sawdust in her hair and pride on her face. "It's perfect," she said, and James had to agree. It wasn't perfect in the way that Richard Sterling's money could buy, flawless and expensive and cold. It was perfect in the way that mattered, made with love, built to last, and big enough to hold all the stories they would create together. Like the family they'd become, it was worth more than money could measure and stronger than any storm that might try to tear it down. That evening, as they celebrated Ruby's achievement with dinner at the nicest restaurant in the neighboring town, Ben realized that he hadn't thought about Sarah in terms of loss and absence for weeks. His wife's memory remained present in their lives, but transformed from source of grief into foundation for gratitude and ongoing love. Isabella had never tried to replace Sarah or compete with her legacy. Instead, she'd helped Ben and Ruby expand their understanding of family to include new forms of love that didn't diminish what came before. The music box Sarah had given him years ago still played its familiar melody each evening at 6 o'clock, but now it served as signal for family dinner rather than reminder of solitary grief. Isabella had learned to cook Sarah's favorite recipes from the handwritten cards tucked into kitchen drawers, not to erase the past, but to honor it while building something new and equally meaningful. Ruby set the table with careful attention to details Isabella had taught her, using Sarah's china on special occasions and everyday dishes with equal reverence for the rituals that made ordinary moments feel significant. As summer approached with its promise of long afternoons and lazy evenings, Ben found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to imagine since Sarah's death. Not the desperate planning of someone trying to control outcomes, but the quiet anticipation of someone who'd learned to trust that love could survive loss and grow stronger rather than weaker when shared with people who understood both its power and its fragility. One evening in late June, as they sat on the front porch watching Ruby chase fireflies in the yard, while cricket songs provided soundtrack to the day's gentle ending, Isabella leaned against Ben's shoulder with comfortable intimacy that no longer felt borrowed or temporary. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words almost lost beneath the sounds of summer evening in a small town where extraordinary things happened between ordinary people who were brave enough to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected forms. "For what?" Ben asked, though he thought he knew the answer from the contentment in her voice and the way she'd settled into their life like someone who'd finally found where she belonged after years of searching in places that offered everything except what she actually needed. Isabella was quiet for so long he thought she might have fallen asleep against his shoulder, but then she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to value words too much to waste them on anything less than truth. "For showing me that family isn't something you're born into or something you lose when people die," she said. "It's something you choose to build with people who love you enough to let you be exactly who you are, even when who you are is complicated and comes with baggage from worlds that don't understand what you need to be happy." Her observation hung in the warm air between them, accompanied by Ruby's delighted laughter as she caught another firefly in cupped palms before releasing it back into the gathering darkness. Ben didn't respond immediately, understanding that some truths were too important to acknowledge with casual words or automatic reassurances. Instead, he tightened his arm around Isabella's shoulders and watched their daughter, because that's what Ruby had become to Isabella, just as Isabella had become the mother Ruby needed. Celebrate the simple magic of summer evening in a place where love had room to grow, in directions none of them could have predicted or planned. The workshop window glowed with warm light from the lamp Ben had left burning over his current project, a rocking chair he was crafting for the covered porch, where they spent most of their evening hours now that the weather was warm enough for sitting outside and watching the world settle into peaceful darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own small challenges and ordinary blessings, but tonight offered the perfect completeness of family dinner and shared stories, of fireflies and cricket songs, and the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to be fully present with each other without needing constant entertainment or distraction. Ruby ran up the porch steps with grass stains on her knees and joy shining in her face, ready to share discoveries about insect behavior and theories about where fireflies went during the day and whether they remembered the children who caught them gently before setting them free. Ben and Isabella made room for her between them on the porch swing, 3 people who'd found each other through circumstances none of them could have engineered, but all of them had learned to treasure as evidence that the universe sometimes arranged itself in favor of love rather than loss, hope rather than resignation, and the kinds of happy endings that grew slowly from daily choices to stay present and keep building something beautiful together. Why Pine Ridge? The question had been eating at him since Webb's visit, since learning that Alexandra's presence in their town hadn't been the accident she'd claimed. Because you were here. The answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. I've been following your career since Seattle. What happened to your wife, how you left firefighting, where you ended up. When I needed to disappear for a while, this seemed like the right place. It was another lie, or maybe the first complete truth she'd told him. Either way, it changed everything. The revelation that she'd come to Pine Ridge specifically because of him recontextualized every interaction they'd shared. The convenient plumbing emergency, the perfect timing of their meetings, her knowledge of emergency protocols. All of it had been orchestrated by someone with the resources to research his background and stage encounters that felt natural. You played me, he said, and the words tasted like ash. From the very beginning, everything was manipulation. Alexandra turned to face him fully, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. It started that way. I won't lie to you anymore, Ethan. I came here because I was curious about the man who'd sacrificed everything to save strangers. But staying, falling in love with you and Zoe, wanting to build something real, that was never part of any plan. Her voice broke slightly on the last words. I've never been as happy as I was these past few weeks, pretending to be someone who could belong in your world. You didn't have to pretend. The words came out before he could stop them, carrying more truth than he'd intended to reveal. The woman who taught Zoe origami and fixed my coffee maker and showed up to help save children, that person was real, regardless of your bank account. Alexandra's smile was sad and beautiful, and full of the kind of regret that came from understanding how completely they'd misunderstood each other. Was she? Because I'm not sure I know the difference between Alexandra Hamilton and Alex from Pine Ridge anymore. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Webb and his security team. The black SUVs pulled up with the same coordinated precision they'd shown before, but this time Webb emerged with the grim efficiency of someone who'd run out of patience for subtle approaches. He surveyed the scene. Alexandra in tactical gear sitting beside a soot-covered plumber, while media crews captured every moment. And his expression suggested that subtle diplomacy was no longer on the table. Mrs. Hamilton, this has gone far enough. Webb's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience from people who controlled billion-dollar corporations. The board has expressed serious concerns about your recent behavior. Your presence here today, putting yourself at risk for a publicity stunt, demonstrates exactly the kind of poor judgment we've been discussing. His dismissal of the rescue as a publicity stunt was calculated to wound, and Ethan felt Alexandra flinch beside him. It wasn't a publicity stunt, Ethan said, standing to put himself between Webb and Alexandra. She helped save 4 people, including my daughter. Whatever else is true, that matters. Webb's smile was sharp and cold, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Mr. Blake, I'm afraid your opinion is irrelevant here. Miss Hamilton has responsibilities that extend far beyond your small-town concerns. She'll be returning to Seattle immediately for evaluation and treatment. Treatment for what? Alexandra's voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the undercurrent of fear. Webb pulled out a tablet and began reading from what was obviously a prepared statement. The board has voted to invoke the mental health clause in your employment contract. Your recent behavior, abandoning corporate responsibilities, engaging in dangerous activities, forming inappropriate personal relationships, demonstrates a clear pattern of psychological distress requiring professional intervention. The corporate coup was happening in real time, disguised as concern for Alexandra's well-being, but obviously designed to remove her from power while she was vulnerable. Ethan had seen enough workplace politics to recognize a hostile takeover when it wore a psychiatric mask. You can't just kidnap someone because you don't like their personal choices, he said, though he suspected that someone with Webb's resources probably could do exactly that. We're not kidnapping anyone, Webb replied with the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. Ms. Hamilton will voluntarily submit to evaluation, or the board will be forced to declare her incompetent and assume direct control of her assets. Either way, her association with this situation ends today. The threat was elegantly simple: cooperate or lose everything. It was the kind of choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Alexandra stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone approaching a dangerous animal. "How long have you been planning this, Marcus? Since I refused your advice about the Portland acquisition. Since I started asking questions about the defense contracts." Her voice was steady, but Ethan could see her hands shaking slightly. Webb's expression didn't change, but something satisfied flickered in his eyes. "The board simply wants what's best for the company, Ms. Hamilton. Your recent instability has made decisive action necessary." "Give me 24 hours," Alexandra said suddenly. "To wrap up my affairs here, say goodbye properly. Then I'll come back willingly and submit to whatever evaluation you want." Webb considered the request with the calculating expression of someone weighing risks and benefits. 12 hours, and you'll remain under security supervision to ensure your safety." The negotiation was over before it started, the outcome predetermined by superior resources and legal positioning. As Webb's team prepared to leave, Alexandra caught Ethan's arm with desperate intensity. "Take care of yourself and Zoe. Don't let them make you feel guilty for being a hero." The words were clearly meant as goodbye, but they carried an undercurrent that suggested this wasn't over. "What about you?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I'll figure something out. I always do." Her smile was brave and heartbreaking and completely unconvincing. That evening, after the media crews had moved on to other stories and Pine Ridge had returned to its normal quiet rhythm, Ethan sat on his back porch with Zoe beside him. She'd been unusually subdued since the morning's events, processing the reality that the woman who'd become part of their family was about to disappear from their lives. "Is Alex in trouble, Dad?" The question was careful, the way children asked about things they sensed were too complicated for simple answers. "Yeah, kiddo, I think she is." Ethan pulled Zoe closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the lingering smoke from the school fire. "Sometimes when people have a lot of money and power, other people try to control them. Alex is dealing with that kind of problem right now." It was a simplified explanation, but Zoe was smart enough to understand the basic injustice of the situation. "Can't we help her?" Zoe's voice carried the same determination that had kept her calm during the fire rescue. "I mean, she helped save me today. Doesn't that mean we should help save her?" The question was so perfectly logical, so beautifully simple in its moral clarity, that Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. She was right, of course. Alexandra had risked her life to help save children, including his daughter. The least he could do was try to return the favor. "Maybe we can, kiddo. Let me think about it." But even as he said the words, Ethan wasn't sure what help he could offer against corporate lawyers and security teams with unlimited resources. He was a small-town plumber who'd once been a firefighter. What could someone like him do against people who controlled billion-dollar companies and had the law on their side? The answer came at 3 a.m. when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Alexandra's voice was whisper-quiet, obviously trying not to be overheard. "Ethan, I need you to listen carefully. Webb's people are planning something for tomorrow that goes beyond just taking me back to Seattle. They've been embezzling from company pension funds, using my absence to cover their tracks. I have evidence, but I need to get it to the FBI before they can discredit me completely. Where are you?" He was already reaching for his clothes, his mind automatically shifting into emergency response mode. "The Hamilton cabin on Glacier Lake. They think I'm sedated, but I palmed the pills. I've got maybe an hour before they realize I'm not unconscious." Her voice was steady but urgent, the tone of someone operating on borrowed time. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. I got myself into this mess. Zoe's at her friend Sarah's house for a sleepover. I can be there in 40 minutes. The decision felt automatic, like muscle memory from a life when helping people in danger was his job rather than his choice. "What do you need me to do?" Alexandra's relief was audible even through the phone connection. "Just get me to the FBI field office in Missoula. I've got everything we need to put Webb and his people away, but only if I can stay free long enough to deliver it." The drive to Glacier Lake took 35 minutes of careful navigation on mountain roads designed more for scenery than speed. The Hamilton cabin turned out to be a sprawling log structure that probably cost more than most people's houses, set on a private peninsula with helicopter access and enough security equipment to protect a small country. Alexandra was waiting in the tree line, dressed in dark clothes and carrying a backpack that looked like it held more than vacation supplies. "How did you get past the security?" Ethan asked as she slipped into his truck with the fluid movements of someone accustomed to moving quietly in dangerous situations. "I designed most of their systems when I was trying to upgrade company security. Turns out knowing how something works makes it easier to circumvent." Her smile was grim but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd just outmaneuvered people who'd underestimated her capabilities. The drive to Missoula normally took 2 hours, but they made it in 90 minutes of careful driving on back roads that avoided main highways and traffic cameras. Alexandra spent the time on her laptop, compiling evidence files and sending encrypted copies to journalists and federal investigators. "Insurance," she explained when Ethan asked about the multiple transmissions. "If something happens to us, at least the truth will get out." The FBI field office was a nondescript building in downtown Missoula that could have housed any government agency or corporate headquarters. Special Agent Jennifer Torres met them in the parking garage, a woman in her 40s with the kind of alert competence that came from years of dealing with white-collar crime. "Ms. Hamilton, we've been hoping you'd contact us. Your assistant reached out 3 weeks ago with some interesting allegations about financial irregularities at your company. The meeting that followed was a masterclass in federal investigation techniques. Agent Torres and her team went through Alexandra's evidence with the methodical precision of people who'd built careers on attention to detail. Financial records, email communications, recorded phone calls, years of carefully documented proof that Webb and several board members had been systematically looting Hamilton Industries while positioning themselves to take control of the company. This is enough for multiple indictments," Torres said after reviewing the core evidence files. "Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, probably RICO charges if we can prove the pattern extends far enough. You've done excellent work documenting this, Ms. Hamilton." Alexandra's relief was obvious, though she tried to maintain the composed facade that probably served her well in boardroom negotiations. "What happens now? Now we arrest the people responsible, and you go back to running your company," Torres replied, with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed taking down financial criminals. "We'll coordinate with Seattle PD to execute warrants simultaneously. Webb and his associates will be in custody before they realize what's happening." It was the kind of swift justice that rarely happened in corporate crime cases, made possible by Alexandra's meticulous documentation and willingness to cooperate. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt different than their desperate escape 12 hours earlier. Alexandra was quiet, staring out the window at the Montana landscape she'd grown to love during her brief time as a small-town tourist. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked as they reached the outskirts of town. "Go back to being a billionaire CEO, I suppose. Try to rebuild a company that almost got destroyed by people I trusted. That's not what I meant." He pulled over at the scenic overlook where Pine Ridge spread out below them like a postcard of small-town America. "What will you do about us? About this?" His gesture encompassed the space between them, the complicated relationship that had survived lies and corporate conspiracies, and the kind of dramatic rescues that belonged in movies rather than real life. Alexandra turned to face him fully, her blue eyes serious but hopeful. "I was thinking about what Zoe said yesterday, about helping people who helped us. Maybe it's time for Hamilton Industries to open a rural development office, somewhere in Montana, focused on supporting small towns that need investment but not exploitation. Her smile was tentative but genuine. Of course, that would require someone to run the Montana operations, someone who understands small-town life and emergency management and how to make complicated things simple. Are you offering me a job? The question came out more amused than surprised. After everything they'd been through, the idea of Alexandra trying to solve their relationship problems with corporate solutions was perfectly in character. I'm offering you a partnership, professional and personal, if you're interested. No more lies, no more pretending to be someone else. Just Alexandra and Ethan figuring out how to build something real together. The offer was tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Working with Alexandra would mean leaving his simple life as Pine Ridge's only plumber, stepping into a world of corporate responsibility and public attention that had already proven dangerous. But it would also mean building something meaningful with someone who'd proven she was willing to risk everything for the people she loved. "What about Zoe?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Zoe comes with us, obviously. There are excellent schools in Seattle, or we could arrange for remote learning if she wants to stay in Montana. Whatever works best for her." Alexandra's planning was thorough and thoughtful, the approach of someone who'd learned to consider all stakeholders in any major decision. "I've gotten used to having both of you in my life. I'm not interested in going back to a world where that's not possible." 6 months later, Ethan stood in the main conference room of Hamilton Industries' new Rural Development Division, looking out at the Missoula skyline while reviewing grant applications from small towns across the Mountain West. The Montana office had become everything Alexandra had promised, a way to use corporate resources to support communities that needed help without losing their character. It was meaningful work that combined his emergency management background with Alexandra's business expertise and engineering knowledge. Zoe adapted to their new life with the resilience that had carried her through her mother's death and her father's career change. She split her time between Missoula's advanced STEM programs and weekend trips to Pine Ridge, where she maintained her friendships and her position on the soccer team. Their family had grown and evolved in ways that honored the past while embracing possibilities they'd never imagined when Alexandra was just Alex from out of town. The romantic relationship between Ethan and Alexandra developed slowly, built on the foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect, rather than the dramatic intensity of their first meeting. They worked together during the day and went home to their respective houses in the evening, dating like normal adults rather than characters in an adventure movie. It was ordinary and domestic, and occasionally wonderful in ways that felt sustainable rather than exhausting. On quiet Sunday evenings, when Zoe was doing homework and Alexandra was reading business journals, Ethan sometimes played his harmonica on the back deck of their Missoula house. The music drifted across the neighborhood, mixing with the sounds of normal family life, dinnertime conversations, television programs, children playing in backyards. It was the kind of simple happiness he'd stopped believing was possible after Anna's death, proof that love could indeed be built on honesty and shared purpose rather than rescue and crisis. The harmonica that had once represented guilt and loss had become something else entirely, a bridge between past and future, a reminder that music could heal even the deepest wounds when it was played with patience and hope. Anna would have approved, he thought. She'd always believed that the best way to honor the dead was to keep living, to find new forms of love that didn't diminish what came before, but simply added new melodies to the ongoing song of a life well lived.